This is Duke University.
The fall of the Habsburg dual monarchy plummeted both Austria and Hungary into a deep crisis, and memory regarding the old empire did not play a great role in the years to follow, I would suggest. I would claim that this became much more important in the years immediately before and especially after the Second World War, when under the metaphor of the sunken empire, so many different ideological, political, and cultural connections and even current affairs were summarized. Although this talk will focus on the memory in Hungary in the interwar period, it will make sense for me to make some, from time to time, to refer to the Austrian case in this matter as a kind of a mirror, simply because the discourse in Austria was at first sight in many ways similar, albeit with a radically different result, as I will suggest. And in many ways, the new Austria very quickly could conclude its history with the Habsburgs, or as the essayist Anton Kuh formulated, was gestorben ist, hat tot zu sein. But while Austria, after 1918, still had to completely redefine itself, Hungary's substance or national identity, its constituency, by no means had to be rethought or even retuned. Looking at the disputes, controversies, analysis in Austria, we might say that irrespective of the political orientation of the author, these text manifestos, programs, statements were almost all looking into the future, a future which was evidently always interpreted differently by Social Democrats, by the Pan-Germans, or by the Christian Socialists. On the other hand, comparable texts in Hungary were generally looking back, trying to find an explanation what or who is to be blamed for the tragedy. It was a different kind of nostalgia, reactivating historical traditions, and it was evidently also a question of political affiliation, which tradition was to be reactivated. But tragedy for the Hungarian elite was not the end of dualism. It was in fact the peace treaty of Trianon. For Hungary, the fall of the dual empire was just a collateral damage of the real catastrophe, the dissolution of St. Stephen's Kingdom of Hungary, the severe territorial losses to the successor states. Until today, the end of the First World War is illustrated in Austria by a rather neutral cartographic representation of the successor states, which by today does not invoke any emotions, while in Hungary the same is done usually by a visualization of the breakdown of Greater Hungary, a still highly emotional issue, as you can see. Hungarians' relationship to the dual monarchy was a hate-love relationship. Therefore, Hungary also, I would say, overcame its link to the Habsburg monarchy very quickly. Remembering it immediately after its fall was not so multi-layered and overburdened in Hungary as it is today or as it was in the 1960s, 70s, after the so many discontinuities and ruptures of the 20th century history of the country. After more than 400 years of Habsburg rule and a more or less common, albeit conflict-riddled history, I'm aware that it is very provocative to claim that these 4 centuries almost immediately were forgotten, while a very strict form of a national history of craving for independence was engraved in the minds. The peace treaty of Trianon was a tragedy indeed, but it didn't go into the substance of forging identity through history. On the contrary, it aggravated the fight for and around history. Only Trianon made Hungary so obsessed about its history. By the way, understandably, since the only feasible argument for a revision of the peace treaty was history, the reference to 1,000 years realm. Neither ethnical, economic, nor linguistic, nor cultural arguments worked. And even the geographical argument for topographical unity of the Carpathian Basin was easily reversible. The same territories were identified as unity or disunity according to the author's political preferences. Understandable, then, is also the new distinctive political role of the historians in interwar Hungary when we face the fact that it was their profession that 1920 had lost almost everything, their research object, their sources, and big proportions of its audience. While the historians consecrated to the dissolution of the dual monarchy often only one chapter and at times even only a page or two, whole volumes were devoted to the breaking up of St. Stephen's Hungary. Interestingly, Austria, just to illustrate the difference again, meanwhile was confronted with ruptures, discontinuities, was confronted with more or less 2 or 3 historical narratives rooted in completely dissimilar environments and ideologies. But this also, I would argue, led to the possibility to let historical links approaches easily go. The past became a minor player, nostalgia only a playground in the very beginning, not very successful construction of identity. Meanwhile, in Hungary, discussions on the fall of monarchy in historiography and political journalism alike were linked to the interpretation of the Compromise of 1867. The main representatives, among many others, of these historiographical discussions were 3 names now, Gyula Szekfő, Gustav Grass, and Oskar Jászai, who then already was in exile. Up to today, this compromise is still discussed in Hungary, but more and more becomes a kind of a metaphor for all possible social or political questions. And it is still a debate in Hungary if Hungary benefited from this compromise or not. In the conservative account of Szekfő, called 3 Generations, Gyula Szekfő, a historian, neither the Habsburg monarchy itself was in the center of the argumentation, nor the question how its acute problems might have been solved. In his view, Hungary always was seen out of the perspective of the Magyars, and not of a multi-ethnic, or not to mention even supranational state, which could have been reorganized on the principles of national equality. On the other side, the liberal Gustav Grass, also historian and monarchist, having been involved in both restoration attempts of Habsburg King Charles IV, Charles I in Austria, composed his works later and under different circumstances. His account was not, as Gyula Szekfő's, an indictment of the previous liberal era between 1867 and 1918, but it was rather a kind of a nostalgic view on the history of the dual monarchy. But we need to know that it was already written in the shadow of forthcoming totalitarianism. So the Habsburg Empire was looked at in a nostalgic way, and its dissolution was conveyed as a capital mistake, and not so much for political reasons, but for economic ones. And Gustav Grass here introduced the question for the first time in Hungarian historiography of the multi-ethnicity of former Hungary and Austria-Hungary, stating that the European significance, its right to exist, was that it combined so many ethnic configurations within its borders. It's here that the discourse and topos of multi-ethnicity is introduced, while the Austrians, just to remind you again, operated with the trope of supranationality. Oskar Jászai's book, and I will not go into that because Ilse is going to elaborate on that tomorrow, is also a very important book, but it was never received in Hungary because it was written in English and translated only in the 1970s or 80s, a kind of a hype under communism for the dual monarchy. It also had a very different assignment, but Ilse will go into that tomorrow, so I'm not talking about that. On the level of the political essay, journalism, and memoir literature, the Hungarian historian Gergely Romsitz in 2004 analyzed and compared the narration and memory techniques of memoirs of Austrian and Hungarian elites between 1918 and 1945 on the memory and self-representation of the dual monarchy. For the Austrian case, in his analysis, he formed groups with similar patterns. One he labeled the old Austrians, and we also heard about them, representatives of the Imperial Royal Army, the Catholic elite around the court, Afro Jewish groups, the liberal German-speaking bourgeoisie, and the other group he called the New Austrians. Essentially, they were the Pan-Germans and the Social Democrats. The old Austrians made Habsburg vanish in a mythical realm, and by creating a virtual cultural memory, something similar to what Joseph Roth did in the 30s, were overcoming the past while also envisaging a new empire. The New Austrians were creating a new era in which the Habsburgs were literally expatriated, locked into the past. The Habsburg state for them was not a historical necessity, but an artificial construction, which had simply fallen apart and was not to be re-erected. Here, the text didn't look for scapegoats, but placed the causes for the fall in the lack of élan vital, or better, ethnical determination of the monarchy. As a consequence, Austrianness had to return to its ethnic roots, which is Germanness or Germanhood. So 1918, in this respect, for the new Austrians, was the beginning of a new era. For the old ones, the end of an old one. But I would argue both shared the ability to finish with the recent past. For the Hungarian counterparts, also analyzed by Romschitz, history, in my eyes, remained open, neither for the nostalgics nor the critics of the dualist system. Hungary was a historical construction, since it was something natural, God-given, the essence per se. The Hungarian elite by this time, in 1918, was so much involved on the other side in dualism that the dissolution of the monarchy hit them very unexpectedly. At first, they were looking for the ones to be blamed. And as usual in the Hungarian very much text-oriented culture, they explained, argued, and analyzed, while Austrian text, I would argue, and also images dreamt and mystified. But the Hungarian critiques generally already knew the outcome of their analyses because they had their hypotheses and they didn't want to falsify them or verify them. They knew the result, and so they were not interested in a really inspection of falsification of their hypothesis. So more or less they just structured an unformed historical memory and consolidated an already retrievable, in some way canonized collective anti-Habsburg memory. Crucial in all these accounts was never the question of the survival of the dual monarchy, but the causes of the dissolution of the Kingdom of Hungary, historical Hungary. And while Austrians in general told and still tell the history of the monarchy from a multi- or supranational perspective, Hungarians simply ignored the ethnic diversity, even of the Translatanian of their part, emphasizing assimilation and acculturation, evidently to the Hungarian slim majority. In the center of all discourses were the so-called historical rights, which could form a rationale for reclaiming the lost territories, as I already told. But even visual media, just to show that, but even the visual media argued along these lines. Political posters demanding or elevating the new republic in 1918 show a stylized, dishonored monarch's crown, but never even the symbol-burdened Holy Crown of St. Stephen, more or less the symbol of larger Hungary. You can see that now, but it's always kind of a stylized royal crown, not the real one, which is a very distinctive symbol for Hungary. A symbol which was obviously so strong that even in 1918 it could not be disparaged. Naturally, in this process we also can trace the inconvincible nostalgics. They were not a very small group called the Legitimists, and in these accounts, and even these were split into the so-called Carlists, who wanted to re-erect Habsburg monarchy, and the three king electors who wanted to have a Hungarian dynasty re-erected. But they were few, and they all have been severely entrapped with this dualist system. The group, seeing a chance in having overcome the dualistic system for a democratic renewal of the country, was at the time in 1918 stronger. But even their approach was ambivalent, since the price for this renewal was high, maybe even too high. By this time, as I already said, 1918, Hungary had itself so strongly identified with the compromise of 1867 with the dualist system. So the most important political analyst of Hungary's history in the 20th century, István Bibó, that the majority didn't experience October 1918 as a fulfilling of centuries-long aspirations for independence and sovereignty, but as a radical end of a peaceful era. The Hungarian elite, so Bibó, had drawn three lessons of the defeat of the revolution of 1848. First, that the Habsburg Empire was a European necessity, and the European powers would do anything to keep it alive. Secondly, that the Hungarian the demands for freedom and independence would foster and ultimately lead to same aspirations of the minorities in the country, and it would mean that the country would break apart. And finally, that the liberation of the serfs meant an economic collapse for the ruling classes. For these reasons, the Hungarian elite, had made its tacit compromise with the Habsburg, which Bibó despised. And he said on the political level, the compromise between the dynasty and the Hungarians of 1867, which was based upon mutual deception to be more precise, mutual self-deception, led straight into a dead-end street of the political development of Hungary. But by 1918, these three paradigms, had changed, and Hungarian elites, deeply involved in dualism, were not aware of that. And Bieber's analysis, by the way, came in the midst of the Second World War, yet before the Hungarian catastrophe of 1944, when there was still hope. Hungary could come out of this war without major injuries, but amidst the political and social petrification of Horthy's Hungary. Bieber was aware that the fundamental rethinking of history and the past was now on the agenda. But back to 1918-19. Just like in Austria, traditionally, two historical approaches in Hungary, cults, were competing with one another. One I would call pre-Habsburg, the other anti-Habsburg. One is around Saint Stephen, the founder of the Christian, albeit up-to-date state. Another around the revolution of 1848, the foundation of modern secular Hungary. Basically, these traditions and cults were a product of the millennium, the festivities around the imagined, invented 1000th anniversary of the arrival of the Hungarians in the Carpathian Basin in 1896. It's an invented date. But all the strong symbols created around this date were not exclusively then linked to an ethnic notion of Magyar, but also had reminiscences to the old Hungaries or the Empire of St. Stephen, which was a multi-ethnic, multicultural state. Now, in 1918 and 1920, all these symbols, this history, this territory became ethnically purified, which also changed basically their character. The first democratic republic in 1918-1919 tried to push back the cult around St. Stephen, and March 15th, the day of the outbreak of the revolution of 1848, was declared as the national holiday of the new republic. The short-lived new republican and democratic Hungary so declared the tradition of 1848, the anti-Habsburg tradition, the disempowerment of the Habsburg, as the baseline of its very existence. Public spaces were immediately redefined. I mean, all the memories on you see, they were crushed. The monuments for the Habsburg were crushed and replaced. Streets were renamed, and so the normal cult in Hungary to rename everything and replace monuments. The following political system, and also Isa is going to talk about that more tomorrow, it's a very underestimated sequence of the Hungarian history. It's the Council Republic of March 1919, which followed the Liberal Republic, emphasized this break to the Habsburgs even stronger, replacing both cults, the St. Stephen cult and the 1848 cult, by a Bolshevik cult when they refurnished Budapest on the occasion of May 1st, 1919. These are very famous pictures, but they are, I would say, not this so often quoted papier-mâché requisites are of importance, but the paradox, I would say, which is also giving a very interesting view on this Council's Republic and emphasizes the question of socialism, empire, and Jews, that when defending the Council's Republic, the Hungarian Red Army was fighting and was commanded by high-rank officers of the Royal Honvéd. They were the commanders, and they were defending basically the historical boundaries of Greater Hungary, but they did that in the name of proletarian internationalism and not of keeping the borders of St. Stephen's realm together. But nevertheless, it's interesting that they were the ones who fought for the historical borders of Hungary, and not the Horthy regime later. Now, after crushing the Hungarian Socialist Federative Council's Republic, is also very important, the name to say that, this Federation of Hungary, the authoritarian Horthy regime, which legalistically restored the Kingdom of Hungary, never restored any link to the Habsburg monarchy. Officially, there was no nostalgia towards the Habsburg, in opposition, for instance, to Austro-fascism. The monument of Franz Joseph, as just shown before, was restored, and while the attempts of King Charles to return to the Hungarian throne were prevented, and not only because of the pressure of the Entente. In Horthy's consolidated smaller Kingdom of Hungary, the revision of the Peace Treaty of Trianon, the restoration of the territory of the historic Kingdom of Hungary, became the overall state doctrine. And the rituals, the sacred ritual festivities around persons or events, the conservative images of the school books were a real prime example of invented traditions, albeit they almost never referred to the Habsburgs. But in this relationship to the country's anti-Habsburg tradition, the counter-revolutionary system also remained very ambivalent. Since it was conservative and Catholic, it couldn't do anything with Kossuth, the leader of the 1848 revolution and a Protestant, and so the system initiated a cult around the conservative reformer Széchenyi and St. Stephen, the founder of the Hungarian modern state, while both again had obviously an anti-Habsburg point, also illustrating the continuity and the habitual claim to power of the old elites. There's also one example, the uniform of the army, which also shows this kind of ambivalence, because they were equipped with a cap which was worn by a Transylvanian military leader in a fight against the Habsburg in the name of the gentry. So it's a threefold symbol. It's the unity of Hungary with Transylvania. It's the claim of the old elites, the gentry, to be in power. And finally, it's an anti-Habsburg tradition. So it's very interesting that the Horthy regime had these symbols which could be interpreted in many ways, but they were anti-Habsburg in a way, but not openly. And also regarding the new media, Horthyism was, I would argue, similar to Austrofascism, not retrograde. It absolutely understood to integrate modern elements in its marketing, and the revisionist propaganda can absolutely be seen as a fresh multimedia mass spectacle percolating all classes and sectors of public life. Dishes were invented, a regional authenticity created by naming them after lost regions and cities. Objects of everyday life carried these propaganda slogans. No film missed to address the topic in one way or the other. There was almost nothing which had not remembered an old Hungary, but there was absolutely no Habsburg nostalgia. Just one remark, I'm going to skip that now. For also Hungarian literature. Hungarian literature also has very few memories on the Habsburg monarchy, and clearly I would argue there's no such thing as a Habsburgian myth in Hungarian literature. The mainstream of Hungarian literature always was social, patriotic, critical, and basically anti-monarchic. While many representatives of the Hungarian political progressive movements, referring to Josephinist reform traditions, saw a possibility in co-acting with the Habsburg in the interest of Hungarian democracy, Hungarian writers never shared this view. For them, the Habsburg monarchy was the evil itself, an error of history which had to be overcome. Finally now, what about the Jews? Because this is the question of this workshop. The Jewish-Hungarians or Hungarian Jews, their memory, their approach, their role after the breakup of historical Hungary. The Jewish-Hungarian symbiosis, the successful assimilation of the Jewish population of Hungary, has become something like a standing text, an almost undisputable certainty in Hungarian historiography and political literature alike. The symbiosis of Hungarian and the Jews in the Kingdom of Hungary, the assimilation of the Jews and the Germans and other minorities to the young and around 1848 dynamically modernizing Hungarian nation was and is still a very influential, if not dominating, model of describing the social structure of Hungary in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. According to this approach, by 1918, they already had become Hungarians. But the question is, what did having become Hungarians now, after the dissolution of historical Hungary, where they had their role and the function, exactly mean? Seen through this lens, this paradigm could not describe the situation developing in Hungary after the Treaty of Trianon, with a clear and open anti-Semitic turn in Hungarian politics and the simple fact that the Jews were not needed anymore in this Hungarian nation-building project and therefore were radically excluded. Identity of the Hungarian Jews, as for other minorities, took now different stances, depending whether they became citizens of the successor states or stayed in what was now Rump Hungary. Certainly, in both cases and for different reasons, old identities expired or had to change, had to be differentiated. So in the 1990s, sociologist Eva Kovacs suggested a new paradigm, introducing the notion or question of loyalties, abandoning and contesting the traditional assimilation pattern, by that putting new questions on Jewish-Hungarian history to the fore. So while in Hungary, the times before 1918, in retrospect for the Jews in Hungary, in Hungary proper, became a kind of a golden era and a nostalgic approach, and Jewish Hungarians here often, but not exclusively, became nationalistic, or at least followed Horthy's political course. For the mainly Hungarian-speaking Jews in the successor state, it meant rethinking identities, affiliations, and loyalties. And there was a clear difference in that depending on the political culture, the openness of the societies of the successor states. In democratic Czechoslovakia, for instance, a variety and range of possibilities regarding loyalty and or identity were granted for each minority. And Jewish and even democratic liberal or communist non-Jewish Hungarians took this opportunity immediately. So in retrospect, this meant that loyalty towards the state or even a nation as constructed by the assimilation paradigm did not necessarily mean identification with it. The Magyar-Jewish symbiosis or assimilation quickly eroded once the state's pressure was gone. In a democratic, open and modern environment, Jewish Hungarians or Hungarian Jews quickly represented themselves completely differently, grasped all possible identity choices as well as offers, and rapidly were highly diversified, were able to shuffle and reshuffle various identification combinations as Hungarians, as Slovaks, Czechoslovaks, citizens of Košice or Kosha, communists, Zionists, Orthodox, Reformists. Varying identities and loyalties meant in a way that they understood perfectly that the world around them had also changed. But it also meant an opening up for the understanding of historicity of socio-political developments, something which did not occur in Hungary proper, I would argue. In that respect, for instance, Hungarians in Transylvania, in Romania, already had less options than in Czechoslovakia, but they still had some. But all this did not materialize in Hungary proper. And likewise, the majority of the Jews, like the majority of the Hungarians, also the Jews got stuck in a dead-end development of interwar Hungary. The erstwhile engine of the country's economic modernization could not be called a reference group for social modernization anymore, simply because the integration in an outdated political and social system was so successful, I would argue. And at the last chance of dynamization, modernization of Hungary's national concept was gone when some parts of the territories or the lost territories came back after the two Viennese arbitraries to Hungary and under the thumb of reactionary Horthyism. To come to an end, in the 1970s and 1980s, Austrian and Hungarian historiography in general accentuated the similarities and comparabilities between Austria and Hungary. In many ways, today, this seems to be a result or a wishful thinking of the then ongoing détente process between the East and the West. Today, more and more the dissimilarities come to the fore, the differing progressions of the two countries made after 1918, which are rooted, I believe, in the history before 1918, and which less and less have to be seen as a common history. So here I would come to a rather provocative conclusion of my talk, that I would say that what concerns Hungary after 1908, it was neither empire, it was neither socialism, and even the Jews is a somewhat another story. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next paper, Imperial Traces in Italian Trieste, will be delivered by Saskia Ziolkowski from Duke University. She is a visiting assistant professor of Italian and Roman Studies and affiliated faculty with the Center for Jewish Studies at Duke University. Saskia Ziolkowski works primarily on the cultural and literary connections between Italy and German language countries, Jewish studies, the novel, animal studies, world literature, modernism, and issues of identity. She has published on Rainer Maria Rilke, Scipios Latapa, Franz Kafka, Italo Svevo, Robert Musil, Tommaso Landolfi, Primo Levi, and Joseph Roth. Currently, she's completing her book, Kafka's Italian Progeny.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
And thank you to Deirdre and Malachi for all the wonderful organization, and also to Malachi for inviting an Italian literature comparatist to this wonderful and exciting conference. In a work on Triestine author Umberto Sabba, Mario Lavaggetta states, "I'm going to start with a sort of paradox. If someone wanted or had to narrate the story of 20th century Italian literature, he could start with Austria, more precisely with Trieste. While Trieste's architecture, public sculpture, food, music, art, language, cafes, and character also all bear traces of the city's imperial past, I will focus on the significance of considering how Italian Triestine literary works, especially those of the interwar years, exhibit Austrian characteristics. Examinations of these previously mentioned elements often ascribe them to location-specific regional differences, Trieste in contrast, for instance, to Sicily or Piedmont. Italian literature does not need to be traveled to, and at the same time shapes the view of Italy as a nation. I'll discuss how these Triestine authors' connections to Austria-Hungary helps to reorient the study of Italian literature, particularly since the ideas behind Lavaggetta's suggestive statement have generally been ignored in favor of other approaches to Italian literary history. Because each formerly Habsburg territory has its own story, something I don't need to say here, I'm going to offer a very quick reminder of the city's history. The development of Trieste into an ultimately Italian city was a process in which the Austrian, Italian, and Slavic, Slovene elements interacted in a number of complex ways. Trieste, fearing Venice's growing power, voluntarily dedicated herself to the House of Austria in 1382. It remained a smaller town until after having been made the Habsburgs' free port in the 18th century, trade greatly increased its population. This development, ironically, helped the Italian contingent of the city to thrive, as traders tended to learn the language that the majority of Trieste citizens had in common, Triestine. Due to its location and makeup, the early 20th century brought frequent changes to Trieste and the surrounding area. Italian Triestine Istrian author Pier Antonio Quarantotti Gambini describes this situation. In under 30 years between war and peace, Austrians, Italians, Germans, Yugoslavians, New Zealanders, English, Americans, and liberals, fascists, Nazis, communists. It seems the needle of an insane compass wanted to mark, one by one, all the directions the wind rose: Vienna, Rome, Berlin, Belgrade, London, and Washington, and in the most critical political moments of each of these capitals. Less poetically and more clearly, historian Glenda Sluga also draws attention to the numerous governments of Trieste and their desire to affect the city. Over the course of the 20th century, each of the various governments that has administered Trieste has been eager to make it a symbol of its political aims and leave its cultural marks. Habsburg Austria, the liberal and then fascist Italian kingdom, Nazi Germany, pro-Yugoslav communists, a British-American military government, and Republican Italy. Trieste, Middle European, Mediterranean, Central European, Austria-Hungary's Zugang zum Mittelmeer, and Italy's Porto Orientale, is often described as being nowhere, as in Jan Morris's memoir, given its mixed cultural and historical past. Trieste also, however, had a great deal in common with other formerly Austro-Hungarian cities, similarities which did not disappear after 1918. Trieste shared many similar cultural scenes, such as music and cafes, with Vienna, a city it was especially closely linked to. For instance, Joyce, after temporarily leaving Trieste for Rome in 1906, complained of the lack of type of cafes he was accustomed to frequenting in the Austro-Hungarian city. The first thing I look for in a city is the cafe. Rome has one cafe, and that one is not as good as any of the best in Trieste. This is a damn bore for me. Outside Italian literary circles, Trieste is in fact better known as the temporary home of this Irish immigrant, whom Ezra Pound once referred to as a refugee from Trieste, than for the numerous modern Italian authors who live there. The final words of Ulysses, Trieste, Zurich, Paris, not only catalog the three cities in which Joyce worked on his masterpiece, but also emblematize the way scholars tend to place Italian and German language literature in an itinerary that ultimately leads to Paris as the presumptive capital of modernist culture. Trieste can, however, also be seen as the geographic and intellectual passage between the German-speaking world, particularly Austria, and Italy. Comparative studies of Austrian Italian literatures tend to focus on the relationship with the more central cultures and places of Europe, such as France and England. Inclusive concepts of literature and geographical space have at times neglected more concentrated ones, which, although they bring together works from different language families, are rooted in historical reality, such as that of the multilingual Austro-Hungarian Empire. Debates over world literature have at times obscured the fact that national literary traditions are themselves not fixed. The shape of modern Italian literature has been seen as a particularly urgent question in debates of what Italy and Italianità, Italianness, are. Italy's late founding and literary history gave its literature a large role in the country's perception of itself. In response to Metternich's jab at the Congress of Vienna that Italy is a geographical expression, Carducci claimed it was instead a literary expression, a poetic tradition. The sense that Italy and her literature were one and the same continued well after the Risorgimento. In 1960, Carlo Levi characterized the relationship between Italy and her literature in a similar manner. All of her artists and poets have, in describing the country, determined it. And these quotes are all from this monograph that is one of the works that sort of goes into this idea of literary Trieste, or literary Italy and what it is. If literature somehow defines Italy, then modern Italy is hard to describe. It's Dante on the cover there. Often seen as peripheral to the modern European literary traditions, the shape of modern Italian literature is more in flux than many other literary traditions, and perhaps suffers from its lack of obvious stars. D'Annunzio, Svevo, Pirandello, Montale, Calvino, Pavese, Ungaretti, Buzzati, Moravia, Morante, Ginsberg, and Pasolini have all been labeled Italy's most important modern author at various times. But almost no non-Italianist is embarrassed at not having read these works, in contrast to Proust, Joyce, Woolf, Kafka, etc. Which author is the most important, as well as which of their qualities are underscored, depends on one's approach. An Austro-Italian, rather than a Franco-Italian or Euro-Italian perspective, highlights elements of Italian literature that remain underexplored, especially since Italy rarely fares well in the more common French-Italian comparison, which often saddens Italians and Italianists and Italian authors. Critical categories are not only shaped by the literature included in them, but also shape perceptions of the literature itself. Thomas Harrison, for example, draws attention to a specific instance of this problem in terms of understanding Dino Campana's work. Some elements of Campana's style are familiar to us from French symbolist poetry, so much so that scholarly emphasis on this lineage has obscured a proper view of the more raw, Teutonic, expressionistic dimensions of his verse. Putting Austrian and Italian literatures in conversation helped underscore elements of Italian modernism, a subject that only really began to be explored in the 21st century. For instance, modernism, unlike romanticism, travel writing, and existentialism, is not included as an entry in the Index of the Cambridge History of Italian Literature, revised in 1999. Its absence from this work, unimaginable in a similar reference work for German, French, English, or American literatures, reveals a little critical weight that the term has had in Italian studies. Italy has often been treated as if it had an avant-garde, futurism, subsequently linked to futurism, to fascism, but no modernism. Austrian modernism, meanwhile, has been a source of great critical exploration for decades. As I hardly need to mention here, its qualities, their origins have been frequently debated. In the 1980s, critics even noticed an obsession with Viennese modernism, both by scholars and in popular culture. These critical and cultural concentrations continue to be developed. Viennese modernism has attracted a great deal of critical attention, in part to its interdisciplinary nature. This apex of activity was not just in one area, but in music, art, literature, architecture, psychology, and philosophy, and other disciplines. Schorsky's much debated thesis that the failure of liberal politics in Vienna caused the Viennese to turn inward, a turn which led to cultural production, provides one explanation for the striking amount of cultural activity. Jacques Derrida characterized the 1963 work of Triestine author Claudio Magri's The Habsburg Myth in Modern Austrian Literature as marking the early beginning of the rediscovery of Viennese modernity. Magris later stated that Habsburg civilization is fashionable because it highlights the unreality that has taken over the world. One of the main characterizations of Austrian modernism and its literature has been its reaction to and representation of crises of language, subjectivity, and identity. The disconnect between growing nationalist feeling and having been a subject of the Habsburg monarchy often contributed to the sense of crisis and loss. Italian Triestine authors were affected by many of the same forces, and much of its modernist literature can be similarly characterized. Trieste, like Vienna, has been described as epitomizing modernity. Trieste contains within itself the tensions and struggles that characterize modernity. Not only did Trieste share certain characteristics with other Austro-Hungarian cities, but these characteristics in turn made them open to many of the artistic developments of Vienna and other places, to Viennese modernism. While not as famous as Vienna's, Trieste also had an active music, art, and literary scenes in which modernist paintings, compositions, and works were produced. Labeled like Vienna a city of paradox, the most salient elements of Trieste vary from Triestine to Triestine. Almost any brief description of Trieste could be called a mischaracterization. The fact that a citizen's ethnic background, social class, religion, political choices, friends, and occupation shape his or her experiences of a place is especially true in Trieste, and almost all the biographies of Italian Triestine authors are full of paradoxes. A Triestine can, like Italo Svevo, go to German schools, love German literature, hear Wagner at Trieste Opera House, learn Hebrew in his youth, be baptized Catholic for his wife, and write for an irredentist newspaper, irredentist meaning the Italians who wanted to redeem Trieste for Italy. During World War I, Svevo was denounced as an irredentist and described in Italian by the Austrian police as a lurid Jew, irredentist through and through. At the same time, he continued to supply paint for the warships of Italy's enemies. Later, while Trieste became one of the most fascist cities of Italy, many Italian Triestine authors, like Svevo, looked back with some nostalgia to the idea of Italy they had had before World War I, when they imagined a more open, Austria-Hungarian sort of Italy. And I could give the very quick example even of Svevo's name, which is you saw was his pen name. Once fascism came, the Italians really wanted everything to be in Italian, so they removed, they wanted all English words to be removed and all French and all German. And they wanted Svevo, whose last name was Schmitz, to change his last name to be something Italian, but they wouldn't let him take Svevo as his pen name because they had an order of sort of what the names were supposed to be transferred to. So in terms of having space for multiple identities, and this is, fascism in Italy was from 1922 on, and has a lot of complexities, and it's not uniform, but there was growing, very strong Italian identification beginning at that point. Whereas futurists were later excluded from divisions of Italian literary culture for their political associations, Svevo, authors of Zeno's Conscience, was viewed as an outsider or even alien to Italian culture. Critics immediately noted the awkwardness of Svevo's language, which was influenced both by his native tongue, Triestine, and his German schooling. The previously mentioned connection between literature, language, and country is responsible for some of the vehement reactions readers had to Svevo's not very Italian work. Instead of framing him as stylistically weak, putting Svevo in conversation with Austrian modernists emphasizes his portrayals of a sense of crisis at multiple levels. Critics like Claudio Magris and Giuseppe Antonio Camarino, who have emphasized Svevo's Austro-Hungarian qualities, have been significant for revealing the Triestine author's literary power. Svevo can be seen as exemplary of a more general opposition to certain elements of modernism in Italy at the time. De Benedetti partially criticizes Svevo for attempting to ignore his Jewishness in his work, but critics argue that De Benedetti's concern, in fact, reveals his preference for manly and bold literary characters. The resistance to considering Svevo a good, let alone great, Italian author was in part a result of the nationalist cultural climate of Svevo's time. A significant number of these Italian Triestine authors, like German-language Austrian writers, were Jewish or of Jewish background. Trieste had a large Jewish population by Italian standards, though was smaller than many of the other Habsburg cities. Historically, the Habsburgs gave the Jews of Trieste more freedom both than they were given in other parts of Austria-Hungary and than they were given in Italy. Although Jews in other parts of Austria-Hungary tended to support the Habsburgs, in Trieste, the majority spoke Triestine and supported Italy, like Svevo. While Svevo is the most famous Italian Triestine author, part of why I offered him as a quick example, there are a large number of Italian writers from Trieste, including Slatoper, Sabma, Quarantotti Gambini, and examining the Austrian qualities of their work sheds new light on them. The fact that there's so many authors from Trieste has been attributed to their urge to participate in and create an Italian cultural scene. Montale has claimed, more than almost any other Italian city, Trieste has felt the need to affirm the ties that bind it to Italian culture, that bind it and at the same time differentiate it. And it's for this reason that the label writer from Trieste could be said to have taken on a very special meaning. And these are busts of authors that are in their public garden. There's Joyce's there, sort of an honorary Triestine, and there's some other busts as well, but it's really a physical representation of how important these figures are to the city. Similarly, literature is a form of cultural participation, has been given as a reason both for the large number of Austrian writers at the Fin du siècle, as well as the large percentage of Jewish writers among these Austrian writers. The considerable number of Jewish and anti-fascist Austrian writers contribute to their later appeal for the Italian left. Austrian authors, philosophers, and theorists stand out among German language writers as particularly important to the Italian cultural imagination and Italian critical thought. One of the strongest literary and intellectual currents in Italy has been that of Fin du siècle Habsburg Empire. Kafka, Musil, Hofmannsthal, Schnitzler, Roth, Canetti, these names have become an integral part of the contemporary Italian understanding of modernity, almost as if Austria were part of the Italian cultural patrimonio. Italy's acquisition of Trieste, the surrounding area, and the 300,000 German-speaking citizens after the fall of the empire contributed greatly to Italy's awareness of Austrian writers, but are not the only causes for Fin du siècle Austria's popularity. The reasons for the Italian attention to Austria are heterogeneous and partially conflicting. The numerous political ties and clashes, in addition to geographical proximity, brought Italian and German speakers together in innumerable ways, and this constant contact brought about awareness and curiosity. Despite Italy's significant interest in Austrian literature, historical tensions and disciplinary boundaries have partially obscured the connections between Italian and German language literatures. So the Italian, Triestine, and Austrian authors are generally viewed as either part of the broader picture of international modernism or as belonging to distinct groups divided more or less linguistically. The history that brought Italians and Austrians together is also part of what has kept them apart. Anti-Austrian sentiment grew as Italian nationalism developed and reached a high in the beginning of the 20th century. The futurist Marinetti presented poem after poem degrading the Austrians and stated in his, subtle way, "We nourished in our blood 20th century Italians' fundamental hatred of Austria." World War I and the growing animosity between Italy and Austria obscured some existing literary relations that have still yet to be explored. Trieste's former connection to Austria-Hungary was the motivation for its special status during World War II when it was annexed to the Third Reich. This political annexation fairly and unfairly linked Austria and Germany and still contributes to reluctance to associate Italian and German language, cultures, and literatures. Disciplinary boundaries have contributed to the obfuscation of the connections between Italian and German language literatures. With some exceptions, Italian sections tend to be housed with other Romance languages. The connections between the literatures of these languages, already linked to their shared linguistic family, are increased by these associations. While debates about the European Union, globalization, and transnationalism have increased the attention paid to multi-ethnic Austria-Hungary, global Austria, and other similar critical configurations, generally look east rather than south. Meanwhile, efforts to examine Italian culture from the perspective of Mediterranean studies have led to a further occlusion of the significant relationships between Italy and German-speaking countries to the north. At the same time, in many ways, the association of Italy and German language literature is a familiar one. For millennia, but particularly in the early 20th century, the Alpine threshold between Italians and their German-speaking neighbors has been the location of a rich bilingual cultural exchange. Scholars have repeatedly addressed the significance of the land of Italy to German language literature from Goethe to Sebald. One critic suggested that to write of the relationship between Austrian writers and the Italian world between the late 19th and 20th centuries would be to compose a comprehensive history of Austrian literature, including authors like Kafka, Rilke, Musil, Hofmannsthal, Schnitzler, Roth, and Bruch. In most discussions, critics emphasize Italy as a place of tourism and inspiration, while Italian literature is ignored. But the connections between Austrian and Italian literatures continue to be an area of discovery and inspiration, as this provocatively titled, critically acclaimed novel from 2010 attests to. And I would happily talk a little bit more about this, but I will just end here, and I'll just say it in Italian, non tutti bastardi sono di Vienna.
So, commentator on this panel will be Thomas Prendergast, a PhD student in modern European history and Perelman Fellow in Judaic Studies at Duke University. His work is focused on the idea of empire in East Central Europe and its relationship to cosmopolitan political projects, particularly the role this region's multilingual and multi-confessional identity played in the formation and articulation of alternative supranational visions of political modernity. Currently, he is exploring the impact of Jewish scholars on the development of ethnography and sociology in Austria.
Well, thank you both for your very fascinating papers. I think they were, in some sense, very complementary. I'll begin by summarizing what I take to be the main arguments of these two papers, and then I'll pose some questions. Béla Rásky's paper advances, as he admits, a somewhat provocative thesis. The Habsburg monarchy, he explains, figured only on the far margins of Horthy-era culture. With the exception of a few historians and writers, the composite polity that emerged after 1867 cannot be said to have represented a significant Hungarian political ideal or a site of nostalgia in this period. Hungary, unlike Austria, looked backward, but this retrospective orientation tended to skip over the era of dualism. Horthyism was instead built around a popular rejection of the Treaty of Trianon and an attempt to rehabilitate pre-Habsburg Hungary and the anti-Habsburg politics of the 1848 revolution. Professor Ziolkowski's paper invites us to reconsider the mode in which we write the history of Austrian, Italian, and European literature. At the heart of her paper is a question: what does European modernism look like when we put peripheral literary locations in conversation with other literary peripheries, for example, interwar Austria and Italy, rather than simply track the movement of people and ideas to modernism's core cities, namely Paris and also London and Berlin? This particular history of Austro-Italian entanglement has the advantage of shifting our gaze, as Professor Ziolkowski notes, southward, away from Ost-Mitteleuropa, if only for a moment, to Southern Europe, and it explains the origins of Italian modernism. It may seem, as it did to me upon first reading these two papers, that our case studies come to radically different conclusions about the interwar legacies of the Habsburg monarchy. On the one hand, we have Trieste, the Little Vienna on the Adriatic, home to a bilingual or even trilingual literati. According to Professor Ziolkowski, the significance of the empire in interwar Trieste was evident in authors' biographies and in their interest in the philosophy of language. On the other hand, we have the more ethnically homogeneous Hungary of the post-Trianon era, where, according to Béla Rásky, empire played only a minor role in public memory culture. It is important to note, however, that we are dealing here with two different sort of modes of interpretation. For Ziolkowski, the Austrian legacy is perhaps only semi-conscious. After all, several of the authors she mentions were Italian nationalists and spoke of their yearning desire to relocate to Florence, the cultural heart of Italy. The legacy discussed in this paper is the legacy of common experiences. As Ziolkowski notes, Trieste was, like Vienna, a city of paradox, and was affected by, quote, many of the same forces that structured Viennese intellectual life. In the case of Trieste, these characteristic structural forces contributed to the formation of modernist literature, a genre long neglected by Italian literary critics. Rásky seems to be primarily, but not exclusively, concerned with the consciously cognized legacy of the Habsburgs, that is, the role the Habsburgs played in the construction of Horthy-era Hungarian national identity. In this sense, the two papers are highly complementary. One, Ziolkowski's examines the experience of imperial pluralism and its effects. The other, Rásky's, examines the memory and the idea of empire. And this leads me to my questions. First, for Béla, I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on the sort of potential structural legacies of the Habsburg Empire and how that sort of plays out post-1918, 1919 in Hungary on a sort of intellectual level. In Professor Ziolkowski's talk, she mentioned one critic who spoke of a sort of common spirit animating the Trieste of Stevo, the Vienna of Musil, and the Budapest of Lukács. So is it possible that some of the same sort of forces or paradoxes that obtained in Vienna at the time and in Trieste also explain intellectual developments in Budapest? Could we consider, for example, Karl Mannheim's Sociology of Knowledge as a sort of Austro-Hungarian product, or reflection on the relationship between ideas and social positionality sort of akin to what you would find in Vienna at the time. I'm also wondering about Hungarians living outside of the boundaries of Hungary. You touched on this briefly in your conclusion. Here you had, here multinationalism was a reality, a negative reality perhaps for the Magyars. I assume a large part of the Transylvanian elite were obsessed with territorial revisionism, but was there any attempt to kind of invoke an idea of multi or supranationality outside of Hungary in these Magyar communities? And I'm wondering if the dichotomy set up between Hungary's backward-oriented and Austria's future-oriented gazes isn't actually somewhat more complicated. As we saw earlier today in Georg's talk, Austrians in the interwar period, or at least in the 20s, routinely invoked the past, and they spoke of the betrayal of the old monarchy. And then in your talk, you discussed some Hungarian intellectuals who described the dual monarchy as a period of delayed or retarded growth for the Hungarian nation state, which would suggest then that they viewed interwar Hungary post-1918-19 as a time of growth, of catching up. This would seem to me to be sort of future-oriented, so I'm wondering if the picture isn't so black and white. And then for Professor Ziolkowski, I'm wondering how people discuss the monarchy after 1918, sort of on the level of discourse. Did authors such as Svevo, who were rejected by the Italian literary elite as pseudo-Italian, did they express nostalgia for the bygone days of the dual monarchy, and did they express that in literature, in other forums? Was Trieste in the interwar period backward-looking or forward-looking? And this is also something you began to touch on, but what happens after 1918 and after 1922 in Italy with these Jewish Italian nationalists? How do the political developments in Italy change the relationship to Italian, change their Italian identity, and in what ways do they try to sort of reclaim an older Habsburg identity if they do? Thank you.
I'm first, or?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the comments. Yes, I wanted to be provocative and make it a little black and white. I admit that, to kind of foster discussion. Regarding the relationship between Vienna and Budapest and intellectual life. Yes, of course, there are many connections, and Budapest in this time after, it has the same fin de siècle development as Vienna. It's kind of becoming a metropolis. I would say the history is very different. Again, even though there are many similarities, Budapest becomes a metropolis very quickly. It has a very rapid development. It's very different than Vienna. It does not have this kind of long, traditional imperial history. Budapest is a very young city. Budapest is a provincial town in 1840 or whatever. This is a peripheral town. It doesn't even exist because it exists of two cities, and then suddenly it has a rapid growth, becomes one of the huge metropolises in Europe, has a very intellectual potential. But I would always see this kind of development, Vienna, Budapest, it's also a competition between those two cities, a constant competition. For Budapest, Vienna is a reference point in many ways. And now, there are many works on that. Lately, there's also this from William Johnston, this comparison between Hungarian and Austrian intellectual life. And there is a tradition also in describing the ideology or the political, the cultural development of Budapest in a way which is it's interesting for me that I would also integrate that in the discussion on the memory of the Habsburg monarchy, because the way Hungarian historians describe the intellectual development of Budapest is shaped on the Vienna example. So when, for instance, in the early 80s, a very big or very famous Hungarian historian, Peter Hanák, describes the situation between Vienna and Budapest, and he calls this book The Garden and the Workshop. I think this is the difference. And he calls Vienna was the garden, Vienna was the clean and kind of a slick city, and Budapest was the workshop. Here were the new ideas. It was dirty, but nevertheless it was kind of a pulsating metropolis. So in that respect, I couldn't answer the question because I think all the histories on the ideological development or spiritual developments of these two cities are also written, at least in the Hungarian context, under this threshold of the competition between these two cities and the memory of the Habsburg Emperor or the not Habsburg Empire, but at least of the kind of suppression by the Austrians of Vienna. So we were always the ones, could have developed much more. I mean, there are all these legends. We had an opera, but Franz Josef, we wanted to build an opera which is larger than the Vienna one, but then Franz Josef came and said, okay, it has to be smaller than the Viennese one. So these are all these legends around. The Transylvania question or the Hungarians abroad. Of course, I mean, this is the point I wanted to make. Maybe I wasn't clear enough. The point is the moment Hungarians, and not only the Jews, get outside of the borders, they are confronted with, or they always were, but suddenly they are not the ruling ethnicity anymore. So they are confronted with their role as being a minority, even though they have in many ways, the economic power, especially in Transylvania, but nevertheless they are disenfranchised by certain laws. Their estates are sometimes nationalized and so on, but their cultural power is there. And there are many movements. I mean, if you, and even today, it's like today, I mean, I would say that many kind of liberal and very new ideas don't come from the Republic of Hungary. They come from the minorities around the country, even today. It's because they had to shift their identity. They were confronted that I mean, what I wanted to say, and it comes also to the question of future and past, what I wanted to say, I admit it was very provocative, but the Hungarians kind of the whole situation makes them obsessive about history. So they have to look in the past. They always want to heal the past. They always want to think about what could we have done that Trianon does not happen. They're obsessed about that. And while the Hungarian minorities abroad, they are confronted with the fact on the one side, they are, of course, waiting for the revision of the peace treaty. We have all these pictures. I mean, this one famous picture still, a Jewish rabbi standing on the main square of Cluj, Klausenburg, Kolozsvár, welcoming Horthy under the Nazi flag. And Horthy is coming in, and he's there, and he's kind of welcoming Horthy because most parts of the Hungarian Jews were kind of waiting to come back to Hungary. But even in Transylvania, you have many. I mean, the Communist Party is illegal in Hungary at the time. In Romania and in Czechoslovakia, they are free. I mean, it's a free party, and most of the Hungarian communists are situated in or I almost said Upper Hungary. It's Czechoslovakia. So sorry. so in Czechoslovakia, and from there they kind of analyze the whole situation. So most important, the literature magazines are published there. There are, I don't know its name now, in Cluj, in Romania, there's one of the most important interwar literary magazines is published in Romania. So, of course, there is, that's what I wanted to say, there is a variety of possibilities, of identity possibilities for them given, which in Hungary is not given, is given, but nevertheless the whole structure of the society in a way is petrified. For many reasons, because of, I would argue, because of this obsession about history. Sorry, I'm too long to answer. Okay.
Impressive.
What? Sorry.
No, that's I'll start with one answer that's shorter and then one that sort of goes out in terms of time. Starting with the example of Svevo, who wrote his first two novels when there still was the Habsburg monarchy, and then his last one, which was in 1923. And there are many more moments in that last novel that sort of point to the distinctiveness of Trieste as Austria-Hungarian. It's set before World War I, and you sort of have, everything from like the cigarettes that are marked, that have the royal insignia, and it's not necessarily portrayed in a positive way. The characters are still irredentist, most of them, with a few exceptions. They still, if they're Italian as opposed to Slovenian or German speaking, then they're characters who would like to be part of Italy. And as you move forward in time and fascism, is there and takes hold and develops, I would say that the literature gets more nostalgic for this period of time where there was a different sort of Italy that was hoped for. So it's not necessarily looking back and saying, oh, you know what, like that was a big mistake, guys. Like Trieste should have stayed with the empire. That would have been nice if it kept on existing because, even though there was a sense of economic loss and other things, but we had this hope for an Italy that didn't happen, and the Italy that we had an idea of was sort of a more open Italy that would have allowed for the facets. And this is not universal to all authors, but it's more common among the authors than, say, Trieste itself, which was a very fascist city. The irredentist movement moved into fascism pretty quickly, and the fascist futurists and things like that really upheld Trieste as this amazing place where things were happening and wars would happen, and there was great nationalist feeling. So I also don't want to say all Triestines, because the authors I'm talking about would actually be pretty distinct from most of the people in the city itself. And in terms of this longer, I think that then World War II and what happened, in time sort of buried a lot of this. And say like the CC statute that I put up that was gone from 1921, when the fascists started saying, we don't want to have this sign of the Austro-Hungarian past. Let's, put this statue in a basement. It was put back up right near the train station in 1997. This novel that's from 2010 that's talking about 1917 and it's set in Venice, but it's in the Venetian area. It's sort of about the arrival of the interaction between Austrian soldiers and Italians, and is based on notebooks that were from the author's relatives, and has become really critically acclaimed and had a lot of success. I think part of that has to do with sort of this part of history that didn't get a chance to develop because of the other things that were developing in that period, that because of fascism, and then afterwards the reclaim of Italian nationalism that wanted to neither be fascist nor, something else.
So the floor is open. Yeah.
Just one short question. You were talking about Italians, Germans, and the Jews in Trieste. But there's a Kulturnitum and there's a modern literature, Slovenian modern literature,
Right. Yeah.
also created up from there. And I think the poems are wonderful poems up till now that just circle around the Slovenian cultural heritage coming out of this situation. You just neglected it a little bit.
Well, I don't speak Slovenian. There are a couple of books that have been written by people who look at Trieste. There's also a move to look at Trieste as totally separate. So to put the Italian and German language and Slovenian authors in conversation with each other. Like Katja Pizzi has a book, and other people have works that sort of look at that. And while I can say something about how the Slovenians are represented, which they often aren't even or are marginalized in my Italian works, I don't read the language, but yeah, it's a huge, and that's why it ended up being, their sense of nationalism came so much from the Slovenian sense of nationalism. Those were developing
culturally they
together.
were marginalized, but in quantity they had, I think, they were the leading group in figures of inhabitants in Trieste.
Many of them tended to be poor. I mean, the Italian Triestine, I mean, the Triestine did tend to be the language of trade, and then German and Italian, the official languages in terms of if you wanted to move. So some of my authors definitely spoke Slovene, but usually they would learn German to go to, if they wanted to sort of move up, or Italian to move up culturally, so that, but it's definitely, I mean, that's a huge, I don't mean to I mean, that's a huge, huge part.
May I just add one little point, that one of the most famous Jewish families is a Slovenian family. Yeah, the Morpurgos, which came, I mean, which were the most famous, I think, Austrian rabbis of the Middle Ages in Wiener Neustadt, the Marburgers, and then, you know, turned up also in the Austrian monarchy, I mean, to be a very, very powerful family, a very famous family, and then a branch of them went to Trieste.
Right.
So
Yeah,
there's
and
this
religious and
old
for
Slovenian.
Catholicism as well, that the priests would tend to be German speaking or Slovene.
Yeah.
That not Italian, so not Italian speaking, not Triestine,
Yeah.
not the dialect. Yeah, no, it's a huge.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to that's in terms of the literature. Unfortunately, I don't speak Slovene. I wish I did.
I wanted to challenge a little bit your point that about the Magyarization of the Hungarian Jews. I'm not so sure if it was a total Magyarization, because, or did I understand you wrong?
No.
Because if you think about the fact that I don't mention the economy and the economic ties, but if you think about the newspapers in the late period of the monarchy, let's say 1900 or 1910, as far as I know, Hungarian Jews prefer German-speaking newspapers till 1910, 1914. Second point, if you look at the interwar period, I was at a conference on Friday in Vienna, and I heard that Hungarian newspapers blamed Austria, interwar Austria, that so many operetta singers and so many composers were captured by Austrians from Hungary. And I don't know if they are Jewish or not, but it doesn't matter. I think, is this not a hint that the story is a little bit more complicated? That maybe the Hungarian nationalists think that they are in the wrong state and in the wrong empire, and this is a very long story. If you go, it goes back to 1526, when not only a part of the Hungarian aristocracy accepted that the Habsburgs were the new rulers of the country. You know the story of 1526. Yeah. So this is a very, or if you look at the 17th century and the 18th century rebels against Habsburg rule. But I think we should keep in mind the other groups. The German-speaking in Transylvania, not only Hungarian-speaking, the German settlement in Transylvania, the Croatians. You can say that the Croatians didn't accept the Hungarian rule till the end of the monarchy, because Croatian children had to learn most of the subjects in Hungarian. It's much more pressure was taken on in the Hungarian half of the monarchy in terms of nationalization. It was not so easy for Croatian kids to make a career in Hungary, only if they accept that they have to do it in the Hungarian language. As far as I know. Of
course, you're right. I mean, maybe I oversimplified now, but this is the point where I didn't want to simplify. I said, not the Croatians and so on. It's not the question. I said it's the general. What I tried to say is there's one kind of rule in Hungarian historiography to say, okay, there is this assimilation. This is kind of Magyar Jewish symbiosis, which is kind of a standing paradigm which exactly says, okay, all Jewish Hungarians, Hungarian Jews, or whatever you want to it's also a discussion. If you say Hungarian Jews or Jewish Hungarians, then spoke Hungarian, which is not true. But it's not. I don't. Of course, they were kind of the Budapest Jews. In a way, kept the German language, but all the educated classes in Hungary spoke German. It is this famous, when you were raised as a Hungarian child, there was the same famous sentence by the parents, says, nicht vor den Kindern, and all children knew we have to listen now because something is going on. And it's kind of the educated classes, it was the second language. And of course, Vienna was the reference point. I mean, you had to have a Viennese newspaper in a bourgeois family or whatever. And there were the other Jews on the periphery, which, for instance, in Carpathia-Ruthenia, which is the very utmost end of Slovakia, today it's in the Ukraine, they did not assimilate on a language level. They didn't. They spoke Yiddish. There were certain also in then Upper Hungary there were Jewish families who spoke Slovak. I mean, I would say this is exactly what I challenged. This is challenged now today in Hungarian historiography. There are new approaches to say, okay, exactly through the losses of the territories, we learn that this assimilationist paradigm is, in a way, we have to rethink it for Hungary before 1918, because they could easily change or adapt to new loyalties. They don't say assimilation or whatever, they say loyalty. And the Hungarian Jews were loyal to the Hungarian state, but it does not mean that they identified themselves with the Hungarian state or with the. And the other one, of course, there was a Magyarization. I'm not that there was a very severe I think the Slovak language was almost on the edge of being wiped out in 1918 because of Hungarian measurements to suppress the language, evidently.
I only want to stress it because if we talk about the empire and the Hungarian part of the empire, I think we should keep in mind the heterogeneity of the Hungarian kingdom.
Quite, yeah, you're quite, and I'm not right. I mean, you're right. I always simplified it in a way, and I will get the critique obviously more times now. It's right. I think because I think that the problem is, or I would say what I try to say is that when you have this millennium festivities in 1896, there's something parallel which in Austria is called the Kronprinzenwerk in the German part. It's from Erzherzog Rudolf, and there's a Hungarian edition of that, which is different than the German one, as we know. But nevertheless, it has a kind of idea which I would call, or maybe which I have to rethink or to discuss, that also this kind of the St. Stephen's Hungary also had kind of an empire which also kind of reflects on multi-ethnicity. After Trianon, and today, the St. Stephen's Hungary is coded as being an ethnically purified territory. This was Hungarian, which, but in this time, I mean, everybody's aware that it's not ethnically purified, and there is a kind of empire concept, I would say, maybe behind that, which doesn't have anything to do with, and this is the difference, I would say. The Austrian Empire is something which is supranational. And it's a different concept, even after 1918, than the Hungarian, which is, I don't know if you can say this is the proper word, gets stuck on the level of multi-ethnicity and multiculturalism.
Yes, please.
Sorry.
I have a question for Béla and Saskia. First of all, you said that there was a reference constantly after 1918, when Hungarians in what was Rome Hungary, to a past that was Hungarian. Was there a particular narrative for Jews in that past? Was there a particular narrative for anti-Semitism in that past? That's my question to you. And Saskia, first of all, I'm stunned that there's a modernism, which is sort of amazing. But I wanted to ask about Trieste, that language which was spoken, I'm assuming was spoken, I don't know.
It's still spoken, yeah.
And also, was there a concept, obviously Joyce picks up on this, but was there a concept of that city as being in any way a homeland or a hybrid group of the residents of that city? Or was there
have to admit, I can only say that in German. I'm over-questioned. It's kind of because it's exactly because it kind of goes to the fundament of my argumentation. Because what you want to say, okay, that there must be then kind of a historical fundament for being anti-Semitic. So we have to
No. I'm just asking if there's a specific narrative. I mean, I work on Polish culture, and so there are certain narratives that are said, you know, the Poles welcomed the Jews and they came in. Is there a particular narrative in that way?
How to then be a nationalist, tell the story of the interwar period.
Yes, and I have to say, I have to admit, I'm overqualified, so I don't know. I mean, it's a very good. It's really I have to think it. If there is. No, but it's really it's no, I don't know. I have to admit, I don't know.
Yeah, there's both in that time period and later, there's an emphasis on it, and there were discussions of, do you call Trieste some sort of equivalent to a melting pot or a crossroads, and sort of arguments of how mixed are people, how does this work? There were definitely discussions. I mean, as a port city, it wasn't just German language, Italian, Triestine, and Slovene, but there were a lot of other people coming in and out, and it was seen as sort of a international place that probably also in some ways contributes to the irredentist movement then to sort of have some sort of idea of nationality, because it was seen as this separate place. And there's a lot of work that concentrates on it as a separate place. So if you look, if you just look at a whole like list of monographs on Trieste, I'd say like almost every single one of them has in the subtitle identity, border, like these terms are really accentuated because it is something that's going on there, and it has studies of Trieste, I think, have grown because of that in the last 15, 20 years. It's because of the idea of global, it's something that gets looked at a lot. And Triestine was just the normal language that was spoken between traders and people. I mean, that was the most used language sort of on the. It is, so unlike some dialects where it's so far that you wouldn't understand it, you can understand Triestine. Written, it's a little bit harder, but you can, if you understand. I mean, there are like X's in it and letters that don't appear in Italian, but you can hear it and understand it. So there's some.
But just to come, to the question, because and I'm sorry, I'm just really getting mad when I cannot answer a question. So really thinking about a good example, and I think maybe one approach or one idea would be there is a movement in Hungary in literature which is called the best translatable, I don't know, it's a good translation, Národniki. I mean, this is kind of a movement in Hungary in the 30s, which describes the suffering of the rural population, which is masterpieces written in the 1930s, and they are anti-Horthy and they are anti-German and they are very ethnic Hungarian, but they are in a way democratic or in a way they are leftists and democratic towards the other nations, to say, okay, we have to live together in this Carpathian Basin, and we are not nationalistic, but nevertheless we are in a way racist. We are, because we are Hungarians, you are different, you are separate but equal. That's the American kind of counterpart to that. But they have a kind of an anti-Semitic undertone. I think there in these works today, if you look, it's always kind of the urbans, the urbanen. These are the big counterparts. It's still kind of a controversy in Hungary today. If you're urban or you are Národniki, I mean, this is the one, and they have, and the urbans are of course coded as the Jews, and the other ones are the real Hungarians. So there is a kind of a narrative, but just one example now. I don't think it's a good one. Just came to my mind.
Malachi?
So I think just as you were intimating that we want to do something Austria and Hungary, it's already handwritten by the way which there was a big difference in the kind of the Imperial of the Empire, because Hungary became as a national state within an made is that actually in the Hungarian continents that there may well be a conception of a multicultural nation state, and one has to admit it was a fairly liberal nation state, but above all, what did in terms of the Jews were seen as part of the elite. The Jews will become marginalized and will become part of the elite. And that's the thing that changes very, very radically, of course, in 1919, where there is no longer a place for the Jews as Hungarian nationals in the interwar period. Now, I think we just scratched the surface. My own sense is yes, you're absolutely right that you will have less among the losers of the empire, among the losers of the, you will have less in Hungary, less ruminations about what the empire meant, unless we move to the emigre circles, in which case we'll have, of course, that nostalgia. We'll have less because there are other people to blame, right? We can blame the allies, we can blame others. But I suspect if you scratch the surface, you will find more of those accounts that there are in. I can't imagine that those will be seen, all the elites that will be seen by the new populist regime of the interwar period did not have some reflection of what it was during the time of the Kaiser. As to the definition, as to the fact that
König.
König.
Yes. Oh, sorry, yeah, of course. I'm very sorry, yeah. There was never an empire of Hungarian, right? The second thing is that what you're saying in terms of that neither Jews nor it's of course precisely the opposite, just as in the case of every nationalism. The new Hungary defined itself against the empire, against the socialists, and against the Jews. But we as historians, of course, have to show, what sort of horrendous lie, nationalism is, right? This is all a lie, right? Because the very definition, implies that the very basic, you walk in Budapest, right? You see the boundaries of Hungary, right? Once, now, the future. And the future looks like exactly like the past. What's the past? The Hungarian borders under the Habsburg Empire. This is the Habsburg borders are the borders that the Hungarians imagine as the proper borders of national Hungary. That shows immediately the sort of the lie. It's as far as the Habsburg are, that's as far as the
The problem is that now they are building fences around Trianon, Hungary.
So that's why Now, in terms of the Hungarian Jews, it's really the rest and else is right now exploring both those in exile, but there's also great diversity within Hungary, just as you mentioned, in the sense that the ultra-Orthodox continue to speak only Yiddish. And my own sense is, again, that's the work that I would like to do about you or here or in the do there. My own sense is these are probably still emperor people. These are people who are first of all attached to the emperor because they don't like the nation state, and they actually find some form of Jewish ultra-Orthodox nationalism against the assimilation pressure. Jewish ultra-Orthodoxy is invented in Hungary in response to the assimilation pressure in Hungary. When you move to the modern Orthodox one, I can see already the sermons in the interwar period and so on, they have become very much into their national ethos. So of course in the interwar period, the Jews tend to be super Hungarian nationalists, and of course it doesn't work. Right? Deutsch doesn't work anyway. The same question I would ask you though about the Italian, although the Italian story is a little happier of course for the Jews.
It had the only concentration camp though in Trieste that existed on Italian soil. No, there weren't that. It's small. It's not a large site, and it's sort of hidden. It's like next to a supermarket, but it does exist and isn't. I'm not. I just, like.
What I was thinking is that precisely as you are trying to uncover, it's against the definition of Italian nationalism. You were actually sort of uncovering various layers. Are sort of imperial layers that dialogue, because that kind of pluralism that you're finding there in terms of the making of Trieste identity and in terms of the making of Christian literature is an evidence for the survival of the imperialism, the property of pluralism. But also, since I read another of your paper, I know that actually that's I think what what Teddy was asking you about, and that is, I mean, the way in which actually some Palestinians, when they are trying to imagine what Italy is going to look like, they imagine it is the pluralist empire, and they don't like that sort of national conformity that is being brought
Right.
with
Yeah.
with
It's something that exists only in imagination. It's something that they're able to return to in literature, but that they don't, that does not get experienced. I mean, but they want to be Italian. I mean, they do want it to be Italian, but they, even when they go back and try to reimagine the thing, it's not as if, yeah, but what the thing that it looks like is often, is that. And that only increases after World War II, because after World War II, then they even more feel like this.
I don't know, I would oppose that, especially in regards to the ultra-Orthodoxy in Hungary, which kept the Yiddish and did neither speak German nor Hungarian, but stick to the Yiddish, although coming from Frankfurt, from the old Reich, and were opponents not so as much to a nationalistic movement than to Enlightenment.
So you don't like the ultra-Orthodox, that's what you're saying?
I'm not saying, I mean, I'm neutral in that.
You know, they finally became Hungarian Catholic in New York right now, so it's not to speak
Williamsburg.
English and teach the kids Hungarian. Can you believe that?
No, I can't, because that's a fantasy, an imagination of a projection of something that never existed.
There's nothing